Hello and welcome. So I've kept a diary for most of my life, and some entries about the big events, birthdays, holidays, exciting things that have happened, worries that felt enormous at that time. But when I look back through them now, it's often the ordinary details that catches my attention the most. Apparently, I've seemed to have spent a lot of my time worrying about the weather and if I've had enough sleep. There are pages filled with these little moments about the rain, which we get a lot of, sunshine, which we don't get much of, wind, frost, and whether I'd managed to get out for a walk. At the time, those details seemed completely unimportant, but years later, they transport me straight back to that moment. And I remember where I was, what was happening in my life, and things I've otherwise completely forgotten about. The Brontës didn't keep diarying quite the same way I have. We don't have shelves full of diaries and journals recording every moment of their lives, which is such a shame because can you imagine what we would learn if only we had Emily Brontë's inner thoughts written down? But what we do have is something rather special. Scattered throughout their lives are a number of surviving diary pages and journal entries, small snapshots in time written not for publication, but for themselves. Moments where they pause, they look around at their lives and they record what is actually happening right at that moment. Sometimes they describe the ordinary details of the day. Sometimes they reflect on their hopes for the future. And almost every time they wonder where life might take them next. So today we're going to open some of these remarkable time capsules and see what the Brontës were doing on a handful of ordinary days that nearly 200 years later have become extraordinary. So where are you today? Well, I'm staying in another friend's house, actually in Haworth today, so thank you very much, Alice. I'm a stone's throw from the Parsonage, from the church, from Main Street, and it's a really hot, busy day out there, so I found a small corner. I've grabbed myself a brew in Alice's Brontë mug, I'm sure she won't mind. If you don't already know, I sell these mugs in my online shop, so if you want to go and have a look at this and any other goodies, head down there. I'll put a link in the comments. It's still really hot, so I'm going to save that for in a minute. So yes, I'm here for a few days. I'm going to make the most of it and I can't wait. So, right, let's get on with the diaries, shall we? Let's see what those sisters wrote about all those years ago. Let's start with one of my favourite papers. The date is Monday the 24th of November 1834. Emily Brontë is 16 years old, Anne is 14, Charlotte is 18 and Bramwell is 17. And all four siblings are living together at Haworth Parsonage. By this point, both Maria and Elizabeth, the older sisters, had been dead for almost a decade. Their mother, Maria Brontë, she had died in 1821 when the children were very young. And of course, their two elder sisters followed in 1825 after that dreadful time at the clergy daughters' school. So the household we often think of as the Brontës is already the reduced family we know today. Patrick Brontë is in the house, Aunt Bramwell is there too. Tabby is helping run the household, and the four surviving siblings are growing into these extraordinary adults. what I love about this diary page is that nobody sat down intending for us to read it nearly 200 years later. This wasn't written for publication. It wasn't written for a biographer. It wasn't written for an audience, because Emily and Anne were simply recording a day in their lives. And I mean, what a wonderfully ordinary day it was, because the paper begins, "I fed rainbow, diamond, snowflake, jasper pheasant this morning." Before we get any deep thoughts or literary genius, we get the animals, which somehow feels very Emily. One of the first things she records is feeding her creatures in her care. I mean, we often talk about Emily's connection to the moors, but she had this deep affection for her animals too. And here they are right at the very beginning of this page. Then Branwell returns with some local news. He's apparently been down to see Mr. Driver and brings back word that Sir Robert Peel may be invited to stand for Leeds. Now, I suspect most of us would struggle to get sort of quite that excited about 19th century parliamentary politics. But this was major news at the time, because Peel was one of the most important political figures in Britain, and within weeks would become the Prime Minister once again. And I really do love that detail, because it instantly places that diary in the real world, what was happening outside their door. National politics is happening. Big events are unfolding. And meanwhile, in Haworth, Emily and Anne are peeling apples. They tell us, "Anne and I have been peeling apples for Charlotte to make an apple pudding." I mean, they're not writing poetry. They're not wandering dramatically over the moors. They're not creating any literary masterpiece. They're just peeling apples. And in fact, if we keep reading, the whole scene becomes wonderfully chaotic. The sisters admit that they haven't tidied themselves, they haven't done their bedwork, and they haven't completed their lessons. They haven't practiced their music and would rather go outside and play. I mean, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel a lot better about my own procrastination now, because I've done a lot of that today. And then comes one of my most favourite exchanges. Aunt Branwell walks into the kitchen and asks, "Where are your feet, Anne?" To which Anne replies, "On the floor." I mean, she has obviously got a reputation for keep putting her feet on the fender. And it's such a normal family conversation, you can almost hear it happening. And throughout the paper, we get the little glimpses of Yorkshire speech too. I'm not going to do this justice, I just know. Tabby tells them, "Come, Anne, peel a potato." Or in other words, peel a potato. That one word alone is a wonderful piece of social history, because it captures local speech patterns that were so ordinary that nobody would have thought to actually preserve them. Yet here they are, surviving almost 2 decades, almost 2 centuries later. The kitchen itself sounds as though it's seen better days, because Emily admits the kitchen is in a very untidy state. Meanwhile, dinner is already planned with boiled beef, turnips, potatoes and apple pudding. And once again, I love that little detail, because this is exactly the sort of thing that historians absolutely treasure. Not those big grand events, not famous speeches, just ordinary family mealtime on an ordinary Monday night in Haworth. And then, almost without warning, Emily's imagination breaks through the domestic routine. And in the middle of the discussion about potatoes, lessons and apple pudding comes this line. "The gondols are discovering the interior of Galdine." There it is. The world inside her head. Because one moment she is helping prepare dinner, she's peeling potatoes and apples. The next she is thinking about gondol. I mean, it reminds us that even while carrying out everyday chores, these imaginary kingdoms were constantly alive in the siblings' minds. And perhaps that is one of the reasons I love these diary pages so much. They show us both sides of the Brontes at once, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the young women helping in the kitchen, and the young women writers creating entire worlds. but it's in the end that always stops me in my tracks. Emily and Anne suddenly begin looking 40 years into the future, and they write, "I wonder what we shall be like, and what we shall be, and where we shall be if all goes on well in the year 1874. I mean, why 40 years? I don't know. Perhaps because 40 years feels unimaginably far away when you're 16. Perhaps because they were simply daydreaming. Perhaps because they wanted to imagine themselves as old women. Not that I think 55 is old, by the way, just say that. Emily calculates that she's going to be 55 by then. Anne will be 54, Branwell 57, and Charlotte will be 58. Then they end with a simple hope, hoping we should be all well at that time. And that is where I always pause, because we know something they didn't. When 1874 finally arrives, Emily will have been dead 26 years. And Anne has obviously been gone for 25, Branwell for 26, and Charlotte has been gone for 19 years. Not one of them would reach the age that they imagined. Yet, sitting there in that bustling, noisy, warm kitchen, surrounded by family, animals, chores, apples, imaginary kingdoms, they would not possibly have known that. They were simply doing what all of us do when we write in a diary. We're trying to capture today and wondering what tomorrow might bring. Less than 2 years later, we find ourselves somewhere very different. We're no longer in the warmth and comfort of Haworth. There's no potatoes to be peeled. There's no Tabby telling anyone to peel a potato. No Anne sitting beside Emily. Instead, Charlotte is away from home at Roe Head School. The date is the 11th of August 1836, and Charlotte is 20 years old. And, if I'm being completely honest, she sounds thoroughly fed up. Now, Charlotte had returned to Roe Head School as a teacher. The salary was going to help support the whole family, but it wasn't a life that she particularly enjoyed. In fact, some of the most honest things that she's ever written about teaching appears in this very journal. And as I was reading this entry, I couldn't help thinking how many people throughout history have probably felt exactly the same. Because Charlotte has spent the entire morning trying to teach grammar. Specifically, she's been attempting to explain the difference between an article and a substantive. I don't know if I've even said that right. And it's not been going well. She writes, "I've been toiling for nearly an hour," before describing her pupil as a fat-headed oafs, which is probably not the phrase most teaching manuals would recommend. Because then comes one of the most revealing passages in all of Charlotte's journals. She asks herself, am I to spend all the best part of my life in this wretched bondage? And honestly, there is something very modern about that question. She's 20 years old. I mean, she's got dreams, she's got ambitions, she wants to write. And she's sitting in a classroom wondering whether this is really all life is going to be. Charlotte then continues, must I from day to day sit chained to this chair while outside those glorious summer days are burning in heaven? I mean, what strikes me here is how aware she is of time passing. She's not simply unhappy. She is worried that life is just slipping away and that she's losing precious time she can never get back. Then something happens. She gets up and she walks to the window. I can imagine she did that a lot. And suddenly the whole mood of the piece changes. Charlotte describes a beautiful August morning. The dew is still lying on the fields. The shadows are kind of stretching from the haystacks. The old trees beyond the school. And then she hears something. The bells of Huddersfield's parish church. The sound sort of drifting towards her across the landscape, and immediately her imagination wakes up. And reading this section, I couldn't help thinking, that we're almost kind of watching that creative process happening in real time. Because we've got the sound, we've got a memory, a glimpse of a landscape. And suddenly Charlotte's mind is somewhere else entirely, and she writes, "The spirit of all Verdopolis come crowding into her mind." Verdopolis, of course, was part of that siblings' imaginary world of Angria. Just as Emily's obviously thoughts kept drifting back to Gondor, Charlotte's imagination never seems far away either. I mean, even while she is trying to teach grammar, badly by the sound of things, and even while she's stuck in that classroom, part of her mind is just somewhere else, just off in the distance. She's building stories, she's creating characters, and she's dreaming. And then comes one of my favourite lines. Just as inspiration arrives, Charlotte writes, "But just then a dolt comes up with a lesson." A dolt, as in D-O-L-T, not a pupil, not a student, a dolt. And she finishes with, "I thought I should have vomited." I mean, it's such an unexpected funny line, because when people think about Charlotte Brontë, they often imagine somebody who was serious and reserved, perhaps even sort of solemn. But these journals remind us that she could be wonderfully sharp and sarcastic and occasionally savage. And yet, beneath the humour, there is something else going on. This journal was written only months before Charlotte was going to leave Roe Head School. The strain of teaching was taking its toll, as we can see. The frustration she describes here was very real. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that the thing keeping her going wasn't the job itself. It was writing. It was imagination. It was the dream that there might be something more waiting for her beyond those classroom walls. And looking back now, we know that there was. And what Charlotte couldn't know was that the stories that were already filling her mind and her imagination would one day make her one of the most famous authors in the world. A few months later, probably around about October 1836, Charlotte is still at Roe Head. Unfortunately for Charlotte, the pupils have not become any more intelligent, nor has she suddenly developed a love of teaching. In fact, if anything, she sounds even more desperate to escape into her own thoughts. She begins this particular journal entry by saying, "I'm just going to write because I cannot help it." And I think many people who keep journals and diaries will recognise that feeling, because sometimes you write because something important has actually happened. Sometimes you write because you're trying to sort of work through your problems. And sometimes you simply write because the words are demanding to be written down. Charlotte is surrounded by pupils and teachers, but mentally she is somewhere else entirely. She describes herself as being surrounded by stupidity, and then adds, "School books the employment, as is the society." Charlotte really was not holding back. I mean, although I suspect some of the pupils would be very relieved to know that she eventually becomes a novelist rather than a teacher. But beneath the sarcasm is something deeper. Charlotte asks, "What in all this is there to remind me of the divine, silent, unseen land of thought?" I mean, I love that phrase, the divine, silent, unseen land of thought, because that's exactly what these imaginary worlds had become for the Brontes. They weren't simply games anymore. They were sort of like these places where they could sort of retreat to, places that offered excitement, creativity, and of course freedom. And then Charlotte hears something, not the bells this time, but the wind. Not this little gentle breeze like I've got here, not a passing gust, but a good old-fashioned proper Yorkshire storm. And she describes it as pouring in impetuous current through the air, and said it grows stronger as the evening goes on. And as this, I couldn't help thinking how familiar that sound must have been to her, Because if you have spent any time around Haworth in bad weather, which is probably about 90% of the time, you'll know exactly the sort of wind that she means. The kind that rattles the windows, howls down the chimney and makes the whole house just seem alive. And suddenly the wind is carrying her home. And Charlotte imagines it sweeping across the moors towards Haworth, past the churchyard, past the church, past the parsonage, and then she writes one of the most moving lines in all her journal. Bramwell and Emily hear it. Just those few words, Bramwell and Emily hear it. She's sitting miles away from home. She's lonely. She's frustrated. She's exhausted. But the same wind that's shaking Roe Head is also passing over Haworth. And for a moment, she feels connected to the people that she loves. And Charlotte continues, as it sweeps over our house, down the churchyard and around the old church, they think perhaps of me and Anne. Perhaps. I mean, that little word always gets me. She doesn't know. She hopes they are. She imagines they are. And somehow, that uncertainty makes it feel even more real because it is such a human moment. Long before mobile phones and text messages and social media and all that, Charlotte is wondering exactly the same thing that people wonder today when they're away from home. Are they thinking about me too? The storm reminds her of the imaginary world of Angria and the kingdom of Northumberland. I can't say it. And once again, imagination and reality become tangled together. The sound of the wind is both a real storm and a doorway into a completely new world. But then the mood changes and Charlotte writes, 1,000 wishes rose at its call. 1,000 wishes. What were those wishes? A different life? More freedom? Success as a writer? A return home? Perhaps it was all those things. The sad thing is that Charlotte immediately follows this by saying, they will never be fulfilled. At 20 years old, she genuinely seems to believe many of the dreams are impossible. And yet, sitting here, close to her home, 2 centuries later, we know something she didn't. Many of those wishes would come true. She would write. She would be published. She would become a famous author. Her books would travel across the world in so many different languages, and people would still be reading them nearly 200 years later. But of course, at that moment, she knows none of that. She is simply this young woman sitting in a schoolroom, listening to the wind and longing for home. And perhaps that is what I find most striking about these journals. Not the famous author, not the literary legend even. It's just Charlotte. She's just missing her family and she's listening to a storm outside the window and wondering what the future might hold for her. The next diary paper takes us back to Haworth. The date is Monday the 26th of June 1837, and once again we're sitting in the parsonage with Emily and Anne. All the siblings are in their late teens and early 20s at this point. And one of the things I love about these diary papers is how they immediately place us in a particular moment. Emily doesn't begin with deep thoughts or grand reflections. Instead, she tells us exactly what everyone is doing. So we have Charlotte working in Aunt Bramwell's room. We have Bramwell reading Eugene Aram aloud to Charlotte, and Anne is writing a poem beginning, "Fair was the evening and brightly the sun," and Emily herself on one of her Gondor writings. And it's one of those rare moments where we can almost walk into the room and see everybody exactly as they were. The weather gets a mention too, which kind of does make me feel slightly better about my constant weather reports in my own diaries. Emily describes it as a fine, rather coolish, thin, grey, cloudy but sunny day. Not quite sunshine, not quite cloud, but very Yorkshire. The household itself is still reassuringly familiar. We've got Aunt Bramwell is busy working. Tabby is in the kitchen, and Patrick Brontë has gone out somewhere. Life carries on much as it has done 3 years earlier, and yet something significant has changed. The world beyond Haworth has shifted. And Emily casually notes, Queen Victoria ascends the throne this month. I mean, just imagine that for one moment. The young woman who would become one of Britain's longest reigning monarchs has only recently come to the throne. Victoria was just 18 years old. I mean, you think about it, Emily was almost 19. Neither could have obviously known what was going to lay ahead. Yet, while a new reign was beginning in London, life in Haworth carried on with writing and reading and housework in imaginary kingdoms. And that is one of the things about these papers and what they do so beautifully. They remind us that history and ordinary life happen sort of side by side. And while newspapers were obviously filled with discussions of the new Queen, Emily was worrying about Gondor. And speaking of Gondor, the fantasy world, is doing very well. It's still thriving. Emily tells us that the Emperor and Empress of Gondor and Galdine are preparing for a coronation on the 12th of July. So that's all good. I mean, I always find it really fascinating because it shows how seriously the siblings took their imaginary worlds, even at this age. This wasn't an occasional game, it was this ongoing shared universe with its own politics and rules and conflict and history. And it kind of occupied a huge part of their creative lives. And then we arrive at something we've heard before, the future. Again, Emily writes, I wonder where we shall be and how we shall be and what kind of a day it will be then. And there it is, the same question. 3 years earlier, she and Anne had wondered where they'd be in 1847. And now, Emily is looking ahead to just 4 years. I mean, perhaps she realised that 40 years was a little ambitious, or perhaps 4 years simply felt easier to imagine. She calculates their ages. So, Charlotte is going to be 25, Branwell 24, Emily will be 22 and Anne is going to be 21. And then comes something I find rather touching. Emily guesses, I guess that this day, 4 years, we shall all be in the drawing room comfortable. I mean, Anne has a different prediction. She writes, we should all be gone somewhere together comfortable. I mean, what strikes me is that neither sister imagines separation. Neither imagines the family scattered across Yorkshire earning their living. Neither imagine Brussels or illness or imagines disappointment. What they imagine is simply just being together, being comfortable. And isn't that often the way? Because when we imagine the future, we kind of rarely predict that things are actually going to happen, I suppose. We imagine the broad shape of our happiness and we imagine the people that we love and we obviously want around us. The details tend to sort of surprise us, don't they? Before the paper ends, Aunt Branwell interrupts and Emily records, Aunt, come, Emily, it's past 4 o'clock. To which Emily replies, yes, Aunt. And I love that the diary ends with such an ordinary moment, not a profound reflection, not a dramatic conclusion. It's just Aunt Branwell reminding Emily about the time. I mean, even in the middle of recording a document that would survive nearly 2 centuries, life was carrying on around them. But this paper also carries an extra layer of sadness when we read it today. Because obviously we know something that Emily doesn't. By the time this paper is open 4 years later, life will look very different. The family will no longer be together. Charlotte, Anne and Branwell will all be working away from home. The dream of a school will begin to take shape, and challenges none of them could yet imagine awaiting just ahead. The future they're wondering about is already on its way, and as we're able to discover, it doesn't unfold quite as they expected. I need a power boost. I don't know why I choose at the moment to film in the afternoons, because I know that come 3 or 4 o'clock, it's 10 to 3, especially in the summer, I get these moments where I just want a little snooze, a granny nap, curl up, have a little rest, and yeah, a siesta, maybe. Maybe that's what it is. Too much time in Italy. And I just feel, so a banana normally does the trick, gives me that little boost to carry on. Even though these are a bit squished, I brought them with me because I had them at home and I didn't want them going bad. But I forgot they're in the bag and I threw the bag across the car because I thought it just had my coat in it, didn't have bananas. I wonder what the Brontes would have thought of a banana, because if you've never seen one before, they do look particularly ugly things, don't they? They're not shiny like an apple or juicy like an orange. They're pretty mushy and a very strange colour when you think about it for a fruit, if you've never seen one before. I can't believe I've just waffled on about bananas. That's why banana and a cup of tea is a much needed afternoon substance. I've got the window open and there's a beautiful breeze coming through and I can hear the birds. And occasionally I can hear the train blowing the whistle. So whilst eating my banana, I thought I would also give you another little update on something. It's exciting. As some of you know, I was away recently in Italy, and I don't know if it's a sign of getting older, but I am so fed up of other travellers, with their huge bags and their water bottles and their stuff and their noise, that I found myself plugging my earbuds in quite a lot and listening to podcasts. And it would just drift away into another world. I was doing quite a few history podcasts and audiobooks, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it made me think, this time of year, people are going on holiday, we're sat on the beach, we might be travelling, we might be going to see family, we've got the school holidays coming up. We don't always have time to sit down and watch a YouTube video. I mean, I know while I was away for a week, I'd be lucky to get 10 minutes to myself. But when I did, I wanted to break away from the world and I put my earbuds in. You can now listen to me on a podcast. So I'm slowly going through my back catalogue of videos and converting some of them into podcasts. And what I hope to do is that as and when a video goes live, the following week, the podcast will go live. So if you want to be the first to know what the topic is about, obviously head to YouTube, but you can listen to it as a podcast the following week. So you can take me with you on holiday, yes please, especially if it's somewhere nice and hot and relaxing. And you can still have your Brontë adventure fix. And the plan is to add to this back catalogue over time, just to make it more accessible, more places to listen, more people, because not everyone has the luxury of sitting down to watch a video. And as I get more into my videos, you might have found getting a little bit longer each time. Sorry about that, I'm getting carried away. And we all do it. We all have busy days when we can't sit there for 40 minutes. But if you can plug me in and Hoover at the same time, I'm up for that. Four years have passed. The paper that Emily and Anne wrote in 1837 has reached its opening date. And on the 30th of July, 1841, another pair of diary papers is written, Emily's birthday. The siblings are now in their early to mid-20s. One by Emily in Haworth and the other is written by Anne in Scarborough. And immediately we can see just how much has changed. Back in 1837, Emily thought they would probably all be together and imagined that they might not be, saying, gone somewhere together comfortably. Instead, the family is scattered. Charlotte is working as a governess for the White family at Underwood House near Rawdon. Bramwell is kind of working at the railway station in Luddenfoot, and Anne is a governess obviously at Thorpe Green and is writing her diary paper while staying at Scarborough with the family. Only Emily is remaining at Haworth at the moment. The future they imagined, of course, it's never arrived, but isn't that often the case? I mean, when we picture our lives a few years ahead, we tend to imagine, obviously, this straight line, but life usually has its own ideas. One of the most striking things about this 1841 paper is it's not just a written text, because in the corners of the page there are these small sketches, simple drawings, almost like thoughts that they have slipping out of the words itself. One appears to show a figure sitting at a table writing. Another is kind of looking outwards, as though a figure is sort of gazing through a window. I mean, I find these details so fascinating because it's almost symbolic. If you think about it, one figure is turned inward, absorbed in writing, but one figure is turned outwards, looking out at the world beyond. As though even on the page itself, the Brontes are holding both realities at once. The inner world of imagination and the outer world of responsibility. I think that tension runs through everything they ever wrote. Anne captures the moment of separation very simply. And she writes, "We are now all separate." There's just 5 words, yet they say so much. I mean, for years, the Brontë children have almost been inseparable, haven't they? They have shared their books, their games, their stories and their imaginary worlds. But now, adulthood was pulling them in completely different directions. Anne adds that they are not likely to meet again for many a weary weeks. And there is a quiet sadness in that sentence. It's not dramatic, it's just real. But although they are physically apart, something of their shared world remains intact. The Gondor and the Angria stories, they're obviously continuing. Emily is still immersed in Gondor, Anne is still writing, and Charlotte is still building her own fictional universe. Their imaginary lives have survived separation, distance and work. And what also strikes me is how practical both sisters have become. Because back in 1834, the diary paper was full of apple puddings, untidy kitchens and dreams about this distant future. Now, the conversation is about work, employment, money, responsibilities. Charlotte is earning a living. Anne is earning a living. Branwell is trying to earn a living. And as Anne rather simply puts it, we are all doing something for our own livelihood. It is a reminder that before they were famous authors, they were just young people trying to support themselves and, of course, their family. And then we come to one of the major developments of their lives, a school. Both Emily and Anne mention it in their papers. A plan is forming to establish a school of their very own. For Charlotte especially, this represents freedom, a way out of governess work, a way towards independence for all of them. Emily writes, "A scheme is at present in agitation for setting up in a school of our own." Oh, I just love that phrase, in agitation. It feels alive, it feels moving, doesn't it? But also uncertain. It's full of possibilities, and for the first time there is a future that does not belong to somebody else. Emily then allows herself to imagine what that future might actually look like. She pictures our own sitting room in some pleasant and flourishing seminary, a warm space, a stable life, pupils, they hope, success, they hope, security. It's such a hopeful vision. And yet, even as she imagines it, we know this is a future that won't quite arrive in the way that she expects. But in this very moment, it feels very real to her, and that is what matters. Evening settles over Haworth. Emily is writing alone in the dining room. The weather outside, good use of the weather topic again, it's wild rainy weather. Papa is in the parlour, Aunt Branwell is upstairs reading her Blackwoods magazine. Keeper, bless him, is in the kitchen, Victoria and Adeline are in the peat house, they're the geese. Nero is in his cage, he's the hawk. And once again, the household animals are present. They appear constantly in these papers, quietly anchoring the domestic world. And even as the Brontes imagine futures, they are always rooted in the immediate present. And that perhaps is what makes these diary papers so powerful. One eye on what is and one eye on what might be. And always the question underneath everything, what shall we be next time? So, we have now arrived at 1845. Emily Brontë is 27, Anne is 25, and Charlotte is in her late 20s. And for the first time in this story, we are no longer looking forward, we're looking back. On the 30th of July, 1845, Anne writes from Haworth, and Emily writes from Haworth. It's her birthday. And they're opening the diary papers that they wrote 4 years earlier. These are the papers from 1841. The future they once imagined had become the past that they are now living through, and Anne begins her entry with a very simple observation. Yesterday was Emily's birthday, and the time when we should have opened the 1841 paper. I mean, there's something almost gentle about that line, as though the ritual itself matters as much as the content. These papers were never just written. They were a kind of shared promise, a way of speaking to the future. And now the future has arrived. So, what do they find? In some ways, quite a lot has changed. And obviously not in the way that they expected. The school they dreamt of, it never materialised. And Anne writes, the scheme has been dropped and long after taken up again and dropped again because we could not find pupils. That hopeful vision of a flourishing seminary has quietly disappeared, replaced instead by something far more uncertain. Work continues, plans shift. Nothing quite settles. And then there's Charlotte's life. In 1841, she imagined stability. And in 1845, she's been to Brussels twice, each time staying for about a year. A completely different world from Haworth, a place that challenged her, changed her, and ultimately left her with more questions than answers. Anne herself has left Thorpe Green. She writes that she escaped the situation after a difficult experience. Branwell has also left his position and is struggling with his health and, of course, the circumstances. And suddenly, that tidy future they once imagined feels far more complicated. Because back in 1841, they'd been writing about merrily seated in our own sitting room in some pleasant and flourishing seminary. But that sitting room, it never appeared. Instead, life began movement. It changed, separation, return, and re-evaluation. And what strikes me most about this entry is how matter-of-fact the tone is. There is no dramatic lament, no long explanation, just a quiet listing of what has happened, as though they're still trying to make sense of it all themselves. Emily writes in her own 1845 paper simply, all tight and right in which condition it is to be hoped we shall be on this day 4 years. But then she lists what has actually happened since 1841. Charlotte has been to Brussels. Emily has been to Brussels. Anne has left her situation. Branwell has changed positions. Aunt Branwell has died. The school scheme has failed. It's been revived and failed again. Life, in other words, has not followed the plan, and yet there is something very steady in Emily's tone. Almost as though she is observing life rather than resisting it, if that makes sense. There's no sense that she's expected certainty, only curiosity about what comes next. Perhaps that is the most striking difference between their imagined future and their real ones. In their diaries, they tend to imagine stability, comfort, togetherness. But in reality, their lives are shaped by movement, work, illness, opportunity and loss. And yet, even in the middle of all this change, the small domestic details remain. The animals are still there. The household is still there. The writing is still there. Life continues in its ordinary rhythm, even as everything else is sort of shifted around it. And then almost quietly, we reach the point beneath all of this, the understanding that these papers are no longer about predicting the future. They are about recognising how little we can predict it at all. 4 years earlier, they'd written with hope. Now they're reading with experience. And the gap between those two things is where the real story really sits. When I first started looking at these Brontë diary pages, what struck me most was not the history or even the famous names, but something much simpler. How familiar it all feels. Because in many ways, these entries are not really about the Brontës at all. They are about what it means to write anything down for the future. I mean, I kept a diary for most of my life, and like Emily, Anne and Charlotte, I often find myself writing about things that seem completely ordinary at the time. What I did during the day, who I spoke to, what the weather was like. Just everyday things that felt unimportant at the time. But now, when I look back at those pages, they are not unimportant at all. They are my memories. They are evidence of a version of myself that no longer exists in quite the same way. And they are full of things I completely forgotten about. And that is what makes these Brontë papers so powerful. They are not polished reflections written at the end of life. They are fragments written in the middle of it. And because of that, they are honest in a way nothing else quite is. The Brontës weren't writing for us. They were not writing to be remembered. They were simply trying to record that very moment. A kitchen in Haworth, a schoolroom in Roe Head, a storm blowing across the moors, a plan for a future school, a thought about where they might be in 4 years' time. And yet, again and again, what they imagine and what actually happens are not the same thing. They picture stability, they imagine togetherness, but they experience separation. They imagined certainty and they experience change, and yet the writing continues, and that's what I find most remarkable. Even when life does not unfold the way that they expected, they still write, they still record, and they still try to make sense of where they are. There is something very human in that, because none of us really know what is coming next. We can guess, we can try and plan, and we can obviously hope. But we are usually wrong in ways that we just don't expect. And perhaps that is why diaries matter at all. Not because they tell us what has happened, but because they show us what we thought might happen and how quickly that can change. The Brontës could not have known, sitting in those rooms in Haworth, what their names would come to mean. They could have not known how their stories would travel far beyond Yorkshire, and they certainly could not know how short their lives would be. But that is not what these pages are about. These pages are about the ordinary acts of writing a life as it happens, and wondering, always wondering, where it might lead. So when I look back at my own diaries now and I see pages full of weather and small worries and everyday details, I understand them differently. They're not trivial, they are snapshots, just like those Brontë papers. And perhaps that is the real connection across nearly 200 years. Not fame, not literature, but the simple act of trying to hold on to a moment before it disappears. So less than 2 years later, oops, sorry, I kicked the camera. Am I to spend all the best parts of my life in this wretched, I can't say it, wretched. Why I choose the afternoon to do it whenever I have my little sleepy head on, I don't know. Should have done it this morning. But then I wouldn't have gone to church this morning and sat in the church, or at least close to where the Brontës would have sat all those years ago. Not that it was a Patrick-style service. Just a quick slug of drink before I carry on, and kind of slumped down. Quick slug of tea. Do you know, you get more of a dry throat, or I get more of a dry throat talking to the camera than I would do if I was talking to somebody else. You know, if I just sat in the room talking to somebody. I think because you don't have that pause, you just talk. There's not pause between to sort of catch your breath. I don't know. I sometimes get really paranoid how to say certain words, and I go completely blank. At 20 years old, she genuinely seemed genuinely. There is something quite moving about holding on to these fragments of life. Not the big moments we expect to define a story, but those ordinary days in between. A kitchen in Haworth, a classroom at Roe Head, a rainy evening with everyone in different rooms of the same house, and a few lines written down, never meant for us, yet speaking so clearly across time. I mean, what the Brontës left behind was never a complete diary of their lives, which is a shame. It was something more accidental than that. It was scattered pages, half thoughts, plans for futures that never quite arrived in the way they imagined. And yet, in many ways, that is what makes them feel so human. Because none of us really write our lives in straight lines. We write them as we go. We guess at what comes next. We assume things will stay the same. And then life quietly changes direction without asking permission. And I think that is why I have always been drawn to diaries, both my own and those of others. They remind me that the version of life we are living right now is really only one version. Not the finished one, not the final one, just the one we happen to be in at this moment. And when we look back, it's often those smaller details that bring it all back. The weather, the ordinary conversations, those things that felt too small to matter at that very time. But somehow, those small things mattered most of all. I mean, the Brontës didn't know they would be remembered. They were simply writing to make sense of their days, their families, their work, and their imagined futures. And in doing so, they left us something far more lasting than they could ever have intended. Not just stories, but moments. And perhaps that is the real comfort in all of this. That life has always been made up of these very small passing fragments. And yet somehow they are enough. So before you go, I would really love to hear your thoughts on this and on the diary entries. So I have 3 questions for you. Number 1, do you keep a diary? If so, is it digital? Is it paper? Is it scraps of paper or little notes scattered here and there? Number 2, have you ever gone back and read something you wrote from years ago, and what surprised you the most about it? Number 3, and if you could write a short diary entry to your future self, say 4 years from now, what would you hope to be true? I would genuinely love to hear your answers in the comments, so thank you. And thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do that whole likey, subscribey, hypey thing, because it really does help me out and lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Brontë content. Have a good weekend, take care of yourselves, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Brontë adventures. I'll see you soon. Bye!